going to invite Adam to come and join us. Please come and join us, Adam. It's been lovely to meet you. We've had one short Zoom call and a chat just now, but I've also had the pleasure of reading your fantastic new biography, The Indefatigable Asa Briggs. Highly recommend it. I did get up at 5:30 this morning to finish reading it because I hadn't managed to, always at the last minute. But it's a great read. And I actually learned a huge amount about Sussex and about Asa.
And this will be available on sale.
There's even signed some, weren't you?
Yes. If anyone wants to buy one, I'd be very delighted to sign it for them.
So Adam is a very well-known biographer, and to just give you a little bit of background, Adam is a Sussex alumnus. You studied history here?
Yes.
Yep. And you've written many biographies. A.J.P. Taylor, Hugh Trevor Roper, John le Carré, Boswell, Coleridge, Wordsworth, not just historians. I was asking you earlier, this thing about historians, why is that? And you made it very clear. Of course, it's not just historians, but you do have a thing. You have done quite a few of the big historians. Just tell me why Asa. What made you want to write a biography of Asa Briggs?
Well, I didn't really. I mean, that is to say, I found myself somehow becoming a specialist in writing biographies of historians. I don't think there's anybody else alive who's written 2 biographies of historians, and certainly there isn't anybody who's written 3. I was invited to write this book by Asa's widow, Susan, who sadly died a few months ago, but lived long enough to have considerable input into this book, to read it and to have passages read to her, and to give me a lot of anecdotal detail which has enlivened its pages, and indeed some corrections where I had got things wrong, where I made assumptions which I shouldn't have made, and so on. So she was a helpful. What was the phrase you used?
A critical friend?
A critical friend, yes, critical friend. And I've dedicated the book to her. So, I mean, I didn't think about writing a book about Asa, partly because he was quite a hard man to get to know, I think, and he wasn't obviously a personality in the same way as A.J.B. Taylor was, for example. That is to say, I mean, he was very much a public figure, and it's perhaps hard now to remember what a big figure he was. He was a major media personality in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and so on. So much so that I think he appeared in the same month in such unlikely publications as Vogue and Reader's Digest. Now, not many...
No, that's right.
Well, not many vice-chancellors appear in such publications. So he was a very well-known figure, less so nowadays, of course, but that's because he lived a very long life, and the public has a short memory. But he was also a hard man to get to know personally. He was quite a private man, and although he was a very friendly and warm and outgoing person, not many people knew him well. In fact, I sometimes thought that nobody knew him well. So this is a life looked at from the outside rather than the inside, if you see what I mean.
And it's very readable, and it's got a fantastic sweep of history. I mean, of course, Asa lived a long life, so you would have to cover a long period of history, but that very much comes to life. And it's also very poignant. But I mean, maybe we should start with just a bit of background about Asa, because some of you will have known him, some of you, will remember him, some of you probably won't. Should we just sort of go through a bit about his life and the key moments and things that he did?
I prepared a little sort of 5-minute talk here, just a bit of background about Asa, as it were, an outtake from the conversation. So forgive me if I switch modes. So Asa Briggs, who was he? He was born in 1921 in Keighley in West Yorkshire, a town that sits astride the River Worth, near its junction with the Aire, the river that flows down through Leeds to the sea. Keighley nowadays is perhaps a rather depressed place, but in the 19th century, it was at the heart of the Industrial Revolution, with so many mills straddling the little River Worth that it was said to be the wealthiest stream in the country, in England. When he was a boy, growing up in Keighley, this wealth was obvious in the grand Victorian public buildings and the mills themselves, some of them, like Saltaire, still extraordinarily impressive today. The Worth itself was miserably polluted, yet above the grimy industrial towns were the moors, visible everywhere you were in Keighley. Only a few miles upstream was Haworth, High Worth, home of the Brontes, who Asa considered almost neighbours. There were boys who attended the same school as him who came from Haworth. So this was a place that, when he grew up, this was a place of contrasts, of noisy and dirty industry below and towering moors above. Asa's father ran a grocer's shop, which failed during the 1930s, forcing the family to move to a more humble terraced house in a back street. The family occupied a precarious social position, not quite middle class, but uncomfortable with the suggestion that they were working class. Asa himself was an exceptionally clever boy who went to a good grammar school, and he won a scholarship to Cambridge in the late 1930s. Becoming, so it was said, the youngest undergraduate to enter his college since Oliver Cromwell. His chosen subject was history, but unknown to his college tutors, he simultaneously enrolled at the London School of Economics, which had been evacuated to Cambridge for the duration of the war. 3 years later, he emerged with first-class degrees in 2 different subjects from 2 different universities, a feat which, so far as I know, has never been equalled. Following Cambridge, Asa was called up into the army and soon seconded to the intelligence corps and found himself posted to Bletchley Park, breaking German Enigma messages. Now, this work was so valuable that he never was allowed enough time off to undertake officer training, eventually rising, so that he remained a warrant officer throughout the war, eventually rising to the rank of regimental sergeant major. It's said that when, towards the end of the war, he went to be interviewed for a fellowship at Worcester College, Oxford, the fellows, hearing that they were going to be interviewing a regimental sergeant major, expected a large man with a booming voice and a handlebar moustache to come to march through the door. So they were somewhat surprised when a short, plump, respectable figure waddled in instead. Asa got the job at Worcester and began teaching and lecturing in Oxford. Among his pupils were 2 members of the Sainsbury family and a brash young Australian who kept a bust of Lenin in his rooms as an indication of his left-wing views, Rupert Murdoch. As well as tutoring privileged undergraduates, Asa began lecturing on what were then known as extramural classes. This was a sort of a lifelong dedication, really. He became involved with the Workers' Educational Association, of which he eventually became president. Just as later on, he played a key part in the planning and development of the Open University, and became, in due course, its chancellor. And these reflected his deep belief in education as a means of overcoming social disadvantage. It's worth saying a little bit about Asa's own political views. He had joined the Labour Party during the war, and he was invited to stand in several constituencies in the 1945 election, though he was still only in his 20s at the time. He decided instead on an academic career, and the truth was he wasn't a very political person, but he was closely involved with many of the leading Labour politicians, including Clement Attlee and Hugh Gaitskell. When Labour came back to power in 1964, Asa knew most of the of the new cabinet. And when he wrote to the Prime Minister, he addressed his letters, "Dear Harold." In the mid-1950s, Asa left Oxford to take up a professorship in Leeds, which of course for him was like going home. He married Susan Banwell, a postgraduate student at Oxford, and together they started a family. But Asa became frustrated by what he called departmentalism at Leeds and the inflexibility of the other professors, who he felt guarded their territory too jealously. So when he was approached by John Fulton, Vice-Chancellor of the new University College at Sussex, he was excited by the opportunity to join a new university right at the outset and help mould it according to exciting new radical innovations. He was the very first academic to be recruited at Sussex, and though he was Fulton's deputy, he quickly proved to be the guiding force, the driving force behind the new university, known jokingly as the Crown Prince. In 1967, Fulton stepped aside, and Asa duly succeeded him as Vice-Chancellor, remaining in post until 1976. Well, I just want to say a little bit about Asa's vision for Sussex. Asa saw Sussex as a new kind of university, a new kind of institution, really, an example not just to other universities across the country, but indeed to other universities throughout the world, something that Sasha referred to in her address. Asa's ambition was that Sussex and other universities like it would not just compete with the older traditional universities, but supersede them. Part of his plan, integral to his plan, was to break down these barriers between academic disciplines, what he called departmentalism, which had irked him so much as a professor at Leeds. And so enabling students to carry out study wherever it took them, across disciplines. So take a subject like my own, history, for example. It could spread into adjacent subjects, into literature, in sociology, politics, economics, and so on. The school system that was created at the time was intended to enable one to study a subject with a different emphasis depending on which school you chose. So history could be studied in European studies, in social studies, African and Asian studies, cultural and community studies, and so on. And in each one, it would have a slightly different emphasis. As well as breaking down the barriers between subjects, Asa also wanted to open up Sussex to the wider community. Rather than it being a closed institution, it was an institution that was open to everybody, encouraging mature students, for example, or students without the usual qualifications to benefit from educational opportunities on offer. His vision of Sussex was a utopian one, reflecting his belief in education as a force for overcoming social injustice that I referred to, and helping to create a fairer, more equal society. And in my book, I've tried to emphasize that Asa was absolutely in the mainstream of the post-war, what's often been described as Buscalite settlement, an attempt to build a better Britain along less socially divided lines. So this was partly a political project, partly an economic project, but also an educational project. And Asa was at the heart of it.
Thank you. That's a great précis of Asa's life up to Sussex. Up to Sussex. And we could dwell a lot on the post-Sussex time, but I think probably here people are particularly interested in the Sussex days. What, in doing this research, I mean, it's a big book, and you clearly have done a lot of research, and there's a lot of archival material that you've looked at across continents. What did you find that surprised you most?
Well, I found myself actually in one or two places, which was a bit surprising.
What did you find about yourself?
The most embarrassing, I think, I found was when Asa left Sussex, he left to go back to Oxford as provost. That's the head of his old college, Worcester. At that time, I had just left Sussex, and I took up my first job as a very junior editor at Oxford University Press. and I'd completely forgotten about this until working in Asa's archive here in Lewes, in his house. I applied to the provost to be able to fish in the lake at Worcester. Yeah. And there's a handwritten postcard from me to him.
Did you get given permission?
No.
So Worcester wasn't as open as Sussex was.
I don't think that should be a mark of it. No, well, we could go into the fishing, and but I think that's too specialist for today. No, I mean, there were all sorts of things that surprised me. I think one thing that surprised me is that I thought of Asa as a man of the left, and well, it's broadly speaking true, and he was certainly a progressive, but he was quite cautious in some ways. He didn't like a disruption and fuss, and I've had to come back to talking about student unrest in a minute. And so, for example, in the mid-50s, when there was a question of who would be the new Regius Professor of Modern History in Oxford, I had assumed he would support A.J.P. Taylor, who is, generally speaking, the left-wing candidate. In fact, he supported Hugh Trevor Roper, generally speaking, the Conservative candidate. And I was quite surprised at that.
But maybe he was making his decisions on academic quality grounds rather than political grounds.
And personality, I think. I think he thought that Taylor was irresponsible, as perhaps he was. I've written books about both Taylor and Trevor Roper, and my accounts of this incident, of the whole competition to be Regius Professor, is slightly different to each book. One of the problems about being a biographer is your opinions change depending on who you're writing about. You inevitably develop a sympathy for your subject. At least I do.
We're also following the data. I mean, you find yes,
yes, it's a semi-scientific process.
Student protest. There's a bit about student protest in here, and you said that that is one of the things that was interesting to look at through Asa's eyes, or as close as you could come to through his eyes.
That's probably a great many people in this room will remember the student protest and unrest, which was a sort of pretty constant feature, certainly of my time in the early 70s at Sussex, and even more so, I think, in the late 60s. Some of this protest was about wider issues. I mean, the two major radicalizing influences, I think, were the Vietnam War and the apartheid system in South Africa, which were manifest injustices which upset young people everywhere. But some of them were about very local subjects, rent strikes and so on, and about speakers at the university. There was a big fuss about an American professor called Samuel Huntington, who came to speak when I was a student here. So in general, Asa was very adept at dealing with student protest. And I describe an incident where there was a great deal of uprising about the question of student files. Students were supposed to have confidential files being kept on them, and there was a lot of unhappiness about that because it was thought that these files would contain information about the students' political views. I think this was actually a storm in a teacup, as it subsequently turned out. But that's what we thought at the time. And Asa gave a big lecture, ironically, about the 1870, I think, Education Act, and which was broken up by student protesters, and he managed to calm them down and say, "I'll give my lecture and then I'll answer questions and we'll deal with this subject," which he did. But so he, as I say, he skillfully dealt with student protest, and in general, the impression that students like myself at the time got was that he was a benevolent figure and sympathetic figure. But I think he was more upset and more distressed and more troubled by the student protest than certainly I had realized. And I think in the end, that was something that made him lose heart to some extent in the Great Sussex Experiment. I think it was very difficult for him at times. Also, it was true that there was a faction within the faculty here at Sussex that felt that he was too soft on the student protesters, and that they organized themselves as a cabal and became increasingly critical. They were his sort of the opposition, the right-wing opposition, if you like. And Asa, I found a document where he kept, when he was leaving Sussex, where he made some notes about these people. Some of them were people he knew very well, of course, and he was quite a bitter document. He was quite upset. It was clear that the iron had entered his soul. So that was quite surprising to me and quite interesting, I think. And it's, I mean, the student protests that were at Sussex were not nearly as bad as at some places. I mean, at places like the LSE, speakers were kicked and punched and some quite seriously injured. That never happened at Sussex. But there were notorious incidents, such as a visiting American diplomat who had paint thrown all over him, the Huntington affair I referred to, and other incidents which caused a great deal of local comment. And that was another problem, was that there was a lot of feeling within Brighton and within the wider Sussex community that the Sussex students were spoilt and that they were indulging themselves in protest when they ought to be getting on and studying. That was certainly true in my case.
Yes, you found, I mean, this was actually very interesting for me to read, that Asa had said in delivering a report to the university court in the year following the Huntingdon affair, what happens at Sussex always received more attention than what happens in other places. And I thought that is very true, Stu. Very, very true. And that there may be all sorts of things going on at other universities that don't get noticed at all, but the focus is still very often on Sussex.
Yes, I mean, that's another thing that's interesting, is that Sussex was so fashionable in the late 60s. I mean, there was a front cover. In the book, I reproduced the front cover of Tatler, which has a picture of the J twins kneeling down
through the grass and
with the library background. Yes. And I mean, just imagine Tatler devoting the cover to a university nowadays. It's inconceivable, but it was. People did think that this was a very exciting place then, and it was also the first of the new universities and the most glamorous, you might say, of the new universities. And people came here not just from all over Britain, but also from abroad. Many Americans, for example, came here. I think I'm right in saying the mayor of New York sent 2 of his sons to be undergraduates here, and people from all over the world.
People from all over the world, absolutely. I mean, half of Nelson Mandela's first cabinet studied at Sussex. I think that's one of the things that I still reel every time I say it. But and that was because of student protest. Actually, it was because Thabo Mbeki came to Sussex, was one of the earliest students, and politicised a generation of students who started going and lying down in the street in Brighton, and then. Apparently, Thabo Mbeki said to them, "There's really not much, but you're not going to stop apartheid by lying down in the streets in Brighton." And the students said, "What should we do?" And he said, "Well, raise some money for some scholarships." And we have now had generations of South Africans come to Sussex and still coming with Mandela scholarships, which some of you are supporting. And as a result, half of Mandela's first cabinet had studied at Sussex.
I didn't know that.
Didn't know. No, one of my favourite Sussex facts. It's really quite humbling, actually. And the Constitution, the post-apartheid Constitution, was written in the library by Albie Sachs, who was here doing his PhD. So there's a lot of change has evolved from this campus, but through the students and through what the students went on to do afterwards.
Another feature of Asa's time here at Sussex, which I'd like to emphasise, is the formation of these. I don't know if this is the right term, but satellite units, specialist units like the Institute of Developmental Studies, the Science Policy Research Unit, and so on, some of which failed, but some of which go on to this day, and sort of research hubs. Those have helped to develop Sussex's international reputation. You referred to
absolutely. I mean, the Institute of Development Studies, which is very closely entangled with the university and just over here, works very closely with our development studies researchers who are formerly employed by the university, but the boundaries are very fluid. And together we've been ranked number 1 in the world for development studies. There are only 24 universities in the world that have a number 1 ranking in the QS World Rankings, and Sussex has that ranking for development studies. And the Science Policy Research Unit, which is now part of the business school, is why we have been able to set up the Bennett Institute for policy acceleration. It comes out of that, really world-changing work on science and technology policy.
I should say that one of the things about Asa was that he was very well connected. And he knew all sorts of people in politics and the arts and so on and so forth. So if you went to a party given by the Briggses, you might meet, as well as a cabinet minister, you might meet a famous architect or as I say, a member of the Sainsbury family, or all sorts of people from different worlds that don't normally, not normally found in university circles. And he was good at raising money. He was, one of the reasons why these satellite units were able to be set up was that Asa was good at going around and getting those bodies or individuals that had money to cough up.
But there was an academic vision too of thinking that these new interdisciplinary spaces were worth investing in. That was actually where the change, the sort of knowledge change and the social change was going to come through.
Very much so, yeah.
Yeah.
So.
And those they do live on at Sussex. They're very much part of what we're still doing cutting edge work on. We are going to have to finish now, and I want to end by thank you very much, Adam. Thank you for coming back to Sussex. Thank you for writing this book, which has taught me a huge amount about our history, but especially thank you for coming and talking with everyone. I think you've provoked a lot of memories, a lot more questions. You will be available to answer some questions and to sign some books over in Bramber House. Thank you so much for coming, and have a lovely afternoon, have a good lunch, and stay connected with us. You are absolutely Sussex, always and forever.